Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Iran. About 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption moves through the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 20 million barrels every day. That is a record-scale daily flow for a single maritime corridor, a narrow exit that can move global energy prices with a single risk shock. A barrel is about 159 liters, so 20 million barrels per day is roughly 3.2 billion liters. That equals about 1,270 Olympic swimming pools of oil every single day, or about 100,000 full tanker truck loads per day if each truck carries 30,000 liters. Most of the energy leaving the Gulf is moved by the biggest ships in regular commercial service, huge crude tankers and huge LNG carriers. A VLCC crude tanker is one of the largest oil tankers on Earth and can carry around 2 million barrels in one voyage. So 20 million barrels per day equals roughly 10 VLCC loads every day. Tanker-scale energy leaving the Gulf continuously. And oil is only half the story. Hormuz is also a gas gate. Roughly 20% of global LNG trade passes through this same corridor in a typical recent year. Instead of technical units, here is the scale in plain numbers. Qatar's LNG flow through Hormuz is on the order of hundreds of millions of cubic meters of natural gas per day, with additional flows from the UAE. That is electricity for power grids, industrial heat for factories, and feedstock for chemicals and fertilizer production, not just fuel. On a map, Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman. At the narrowest point, the strait is about 33 kilometers wide. That sounds wide until you look at how giant ships actually move. The biggest tankers and LNG carriers do not use the entire strait like open water. They follow controlled inbound and outbound routes separated by a buffer zone. So the practical traffic space for giants is far tighter than the coastline width suggests. This is why the corridor feels fragile. The flow is planetary, the maneuvering room is limited, and modern supply chains do not price energy by geography alone, they price it by reliability. When the risk level rises, the system does not need a full shutdown to get expensive. Shipping slows, queues form outside the Gulf, insurance premiums jump, freight rates move. Traders price uncertainty instantly. Oil markets do not wait for barrels to disappear. They react to the probability that something might go wrong in the next transit window. Now connect the choke point to countries, because this is where regional becomes global. China is the world's largest crude oil importer, and a very large share of its imported crude comes from the Middle East, close to around half. Japan's crude oil imports are overwhelmingly Middle East linked, commonly described as over 70%. South Korea's crude oil imports are heavily Middle East linked, commonly described as over 70%. India's import mix is also deeply tied to Gulf producers, with OPEC supplying around half in recent annual data. Europe buys Gulf energy as well and competes in the same global market for cargoes. Different flags, same bottleneck. Iran sits on the north side of this exit. That geography creates leverage because disruption is not a single switch. Sometimes it is political messaging, sometimes it is naval drills, sometimes it is tanker detentions or seizures, sometimes it is navigation uncertainty and electronic interference. Sometimes it is simply the rumor of escalation that makes insurers and shipping firms more cautious. Every step adds friction, and when 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption runs through one corridor, small friction scales into global cost. This pattern is not new. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the Persian Gulf entered the tanker war phase, where commercial shipping was attacked and threatened. That period showed how quickly risk around the Gulf can turn into higher insurance, armed escort, delays, and price pressure. The same logic keeps returning in later decades. Iranian officials and commanders have repeatedly threatened to close the strait during escalation cycles. Whether the corridor closes or not, the threat itself is a risk signal, and risk is what markets price. So why don't exporters simply bypass Hormuz? Some bypass routes exist, but they are limited compared to the normal seaborne scale. Saudi Arabia can move part of its crude across the country to the Red Sea through an east-west pipeline system. The UAE can move part of its crude to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman by pipeline, reaching open water without transiting Hormuz. These routes help. They reduce exposure. They do not replace the main valve. Because the Persian Gulf is not exporting a few cargoes. It is exporting the equivalent of 10 VLCC loads of oil per day, plus massive LNG flows, plus petroleum products, and doing it continuously through one exit corridor. This is why the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most powerful pieces of geography on Earth. 20 million barrels per day, 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption, around 20% of global LNG trade. A narrow passage between Iran and Oman with controlled routes that funnel the largest energy ships on Earth. When the corridor looks calm, the world runs cheaper. When the corridor looks fragile, the cost of modern life rises.